Did medieval couples let friends watch the wedding night for luck? In many villages, it was common to cheer outside, knock on doors, make jokes, and wait for proof the bond was real, not imagined. Love was shared with the crowd, not hidden. Today we explore simple, shocking medieval bedroom traditions and why privacy barely existed back then. Let's uncover it. 10 courts of medieval forced couples to have sex in publicly as proof. The heavy doors close and a husband and wife stand before priests, matrons and judges. The silence is suffocating. Why are they here? To answer a question both intimate and humiliating, is this marriage physically valid? This was not a rumor. In 14th century France and Italy, so-called trials by Congress were written into law. If a woman claimed her husband could not perform his marital role, or if inheritance rights were challenged, the couple could be ordered to demonstrate the union before witnesses. In some cases, midwives and matrons were brought in later to testify whether the act had taken place. One Parisian nobleman in 1370 became infamous when he failed on 3 separate attempts before officials. His marriage was annulled on the spot, and his name quickly became a warning whispered in courtly circles. Why such scrutiny? Because marriage wasn't just private, it was political. Without heirs, entire dynasties risked collapse. Records show that in some regions, as many as 1 in 10 marital disputes revolved around accusations of impotence. What we see as an intrusion, medieval society saw as essential to protecting land, titles, and bloodlines. The image is disturbing. Intimacy transformed into courtroom ritual. Private shame paraded as public theatre. And yet this was considered order. But if the law could humiliate ordinary nobles this way, what compromises were the great dynasties willing to make behind closed doors, where no witnesses were allowed? The trail leads us next into royal chambers, where keeping bloodlines pure sometimes meant breaking the most forbidden boundaries of all. 9. To keep our royal families slept with their own blood. The banquet table glitters with gold and jewels. Yet beneath the splendor lies a strange truth. The bride and groom share the same grandfather. Why would Europe's wealthiest dynasties bind themselves so closely, even at the cost of scandal? The answer was control. Royal blood was seen as treasure, never to be diluted with outsiders. Families like the Visconti of Milan became infamous for pushing these boundaries. Chroniclers accused Bernabo Visconti of taking his own daughters as companions, perhaps slander from enemies. But the fact the story spread so widely shows how believable such rumors were in noble circles. The church loudly condemned incest, yet loopholes were always available for a price. Papal dispensations, official permissions to marry within forbidden degrees, were granted regularly. Between 1300 and 1500, nearly 1 in 5 dispensations dealt with marriages the church itself had once outlawed. Kings of England, dukes of Burgundy, and princes of Spain all paid for exceptions. But close marriages left consequences. Some heirs grew fragile, others mentally unstable. And eventually the Habsburg dynasty became a symbol of the dangers of keeping bloodlines too pure. Their distinctive jawline was a physical reminder of centuries of intermarriage. The contradiction is striking. Commoners faced harsh punishment for adultery, yet nobles rewrote morality to suit their dynasties. If wealth and influence could turn a forbidden act into accepted practice, what happened in villages where ordinary people had no protection from the law's most merciless punishments? To uncover that, we step out of royal halls and into rural fields, where accusations far darker than incest led to punishment staged as public spectacle with animals and men condemned together. 8 trials executed men and animals together in public. For many rural communities, the greatest fear wasn't raiders or famine. It was an accusation of crimes against nature. Court records from 15th century Switzerland reveal more than 100 prosecutions for bestiality in a single decade, showing how widespread and deeply feared these charges were. Farmers, shepherds, even boys were named in court, often on the word of suspicious neighbors. Punishments were harsh, designed not only to destroy the accused, but also to erase the animal said to be involved. Men might be sentenced to hanging or burning, while the animal was executed beside them, as if guilt were shared. A famous Basel case from 1466 describes a pig dressed in a coat and breeches before being put to death alongside its owner. A grim parody of human justice. Why such severity? Medieval clergy argued that crossing the boundary between man and beast endangered the entire moral order. Some chroniclers even blamed local plagues or harvest failures on communities where such sins had been uncovered, as if divine punishment fell on all. At the same time, rumors and false accusations were easily weaponized. Jealous rivals could destroy a man's life by bringing him under suspicion, and courts eager to prove their piety were quick to convict. The sheer number of these trials shows both the fear and the fascination surrounding them. And if ordinary men could face execution for imagined offenses against animals, what happened when accusations turned towards something even more unsettling, the violation of the dead, where shame and horror reached their absolute limit? 7. Peasants and soldiers were burned alive for sleeping with corpses. Among all the sins feared in medieval Europe, few seemed more unthinkable than violating the dignity of the dead. Though rare, the cases that survive in chronicles are chilling. A German account from the 14th century describes a soldier who was caught committing such a crime after battle. He was executed by burning before his own regiment, his fate serving as both punishment and warning. In England, 1233, court rolls mention a grave robber who admitted to repeatedly disturbing churchyards. His confessions, taken as proof of the darkest offence, led to swift execution. To contemporaries, this was not simply a crime. It was a spiritual catastrophe. The Church saw necrophilia as the ultimate violation. It was an offence not only against human purity, but against divine resurrection itself. Theologians warned that a defiled body might not rise on Judgment Day, a fear that magnified the crime into cosmic significance. Punishment by burning was common, reducing both the offender's body and reputation to ashes, ensuring that shame lingered for generations. Yet, historians notice an odd silence. Only a handful of cases appear in the records, leaving questions. Were these truly rare incidents, or were they so shameful that most were quietly erased? Some scholars suggest that torture-induced confessions might have exaggerated the reality, but their presence at all shows how deep the anxiety ran. If even the dead could not be guaranteed safety, then what of the living, especially those shut away in cloisters where monks and nuns struggled with vows of purity that human nature constantly tested? 6 monasteries overflowed with masturbation, scandals, and secret He bonds. Monasteries were meant to be sanctuaries of purity. Yet the records that survive tell a more complicated story, one filled with whispered rumors, stern punishments, and scandals that stretched across centuries. Bishops conducting visitations frequently reported discovering chains of unnatural bonds among monks, secret attachments, shared chambers, and coded messages left in cloisters. Some chroniclers even suggested entire dormitories fell into compromise where discipline blurred with desire. Clergy grew especially anxious over what they called the solitary vice. Manuals from the 13th century listed as a sin requiring long fasts on bread and water or severe lashings for repeat offenders. The very fact that these rules appear so often reveals how widespread the concern must have been. In some abbeys, wooden partitions were installed between beds in attempts to curb temptation. The contradictions are striking. These same institutions produced illuminated manuscripts, safeguarded knowledge, and preached virtue. Yet, bishops' letters described monasteries where scandals became so common that reform councils were convened. A bishop in Lincoln, writing in 1290, complained that monks were falling in 2s and 3s as if chained together by lust. Whether exaggerated or not, the phrase captured the unease that circulated widely. Behind high walls, a hidden world existed. Part prayer, part struggle, part secret. Locals whispered, but discipline rarely went beyond penance. And if monasteries, sworn to God, could not silence such temptations, what might happen when accusations of sin spread beyond cloisters into villages where fear and rumor would soon fuel the brutal machinery of witch trials? 5 trials of witches used sexual torture, virginity checks, and demonic confessions. By the late 15th century, Europe's witchcraft panic was in full force. Accusations spread quickly, and sexuality became both a weapon and an obsession within the trials. Inquisitors searched for the devil's mark on accused women, sometimes ordering midwives to examine them in humiliating and invasive ways. In parts of Germany, entire panels of men oversaw these checks, blurring justice with cruelty. Torture produced confessions that were filled with sexual imagery. Manuals like the Malus Maleficarum insisted witches lay with the devil as husband, shaping how interrogations unfolded. Under such pressure, women described night gatherings where hundreds supposedly danced, feasted, and gave themselves to spirits, visions more reflective of the examiner's imagination than any reality. Punishments often carried a disturbing theatricality. Victims might be paraded through towns or subjected to symbolic purifications. In some German bishops, records show hundreds of executions in a single year, many tied to charges of carnal union with demons. The scale was staggering. An industrialized persecution cloaked in piety and fear. Crowds came not only out of moral duty, but also morbid curiosity. Trials blurred the line between religious ritual and public entertainment, turning whispered fears of women's bodies into mass spectacles. This period reveals a society where faith, fear, and sexuality collided in dangerous ways. And if hysteria over witches could spiral into such extremes, what might happen when ordinary townspeople themselves embraced rituals of blood and desire, believing it could hold back the greatest terror of their age? 4. Flagellant cults whipped themselves bloody and fell into midnight orgies. The Black Death swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing nearly half the population. In its wake, fear gave rise to strange movements. Among the most infamous were the flagellants, bands of penitents who marched barefoot through towns, beating themselves until blood ran, believing suffering could appease divine wrath. At first, they were seen with awe, even reverence. But chronicles from Strasbourg and Frankfurt hint at darker outcomes. After days of frenzied processions, some groups were said to collapse into chaotic gatherings by night. Rumors spoke of excesses where prayer and discipline gave way to abandon, their pain twisting into strange forms of release. Whether every story was true or not, the image spread quickly, feeding both fascination and alarm. By 1349, these groups numbered in the thousands across Germany, Flanders, and Bohemia. They condemned the church as corrupt, but their own spectacles became controversial. Letters from clerics warned of unspeakable acts, carried out under the cover of penance. Pope Clement VI himself ordered their dispersal, fearing heresy and scandal more than their bloodied parades. The contradiction is striking. Movements born from a desperate cry for purity risked descending into the very chaos they claimed to resist. It shows how, in an age of terror, lines between devotion and indulgence could blur with frightening ease. If crowds could lose themselves so completely under the shadow of plague, what choices were being made in the private chambers of nobility, where political marriages bound children to adult alliances long before they were old enough to understand them? 3 young girls at the age 9 were married and sometimes consummated. Canon law technically allowed girls to marry at 12 and boys at 14. Yet noble families often arranged unions much earlier. For them, marriage was a tool of strategy, not affection. Chroniclers record weddings for children as young as 9 or 10. Their futures decided in candle-lit halls where families weighed alliances like coin. One of the most famous examples was the marriage of England's King Richard II to Isabella of Valois in 1396. She was 6 years old. Though the union was never consummated during her childhood, its very existence shows how little age mattered when kingdoms sought peace or power. In other courts, restraint was not always observed. In Aragon, records mention a nobleman who declared the fertility of his 10-year-old bride in formal contracts, as if her body were another line of property. The scale is difficult to ignore. In 14th and 15th century Castile, historians estimate that more than 30% of aristocratic brides were under 13 at the time of their marriages. The urgency was partly survival. High mortality rates meant families rushed to secure heirs before dynasties faltered. The church occasionally objected, but papal dispensations and fees often silenced resistance. These stories force us to ask how many childhoods were reshaped by ink, seals, and rings pressed into tiny hands. Innocence itself became a bargaining chip sacrificed for family legacy. And while noble children were traded in contracts, the same world that blessed these arrangements turned adultery into a celebrated pastime among the elite, paradoxically elevating forbidden love as more honorable than marriage itself. 2. In the court of love, adultery became a noble sport. While peasants were flogged for commoners, adultery could bring exile, public lashes, or worse. Yet in noble courts, the same act was transformed into something close to entertainment. In 12th and 13th century France, figures like Elalana of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne presided over so-called courts of love, where extramarital passion was debated as though it were a fine art. Troubadour culture spread this ideal across Europe. Hundreds of songs and poems in Occitan and French celebrated secret meetings, moonlit escapes, and ladders of love raised against castle walls. One of the most striking declarations came in 1174, when Maria of Champagne is said to have claimed that true love cannot exist in marriage. To many nobles, this redefined fidelity itself. Marriage was duty while love was found outside it. The Church tried to resist, condemning these ideas as dangerous and immoral. Yet their influence seeped into literature like the Romance of the Rose and shaped the very code of chivalry. Behind poetic imagery, however, were real scandals, queens whisper to of favourites, dukes accused of pursuing rivals' wives, and knights fighting fatal duels over jealous honour. It was a striking double standard. While peasants were punished for desire, nobles cloaked the same behaviour in verses and feasts, turning betrayal into public theatre. And if aristocrats treated adultery as a game, where did ordinary townsfolk go when they sought intimacy beyond the bounds of marriage? The answer is found not in song, but in the streets, where brothel and red light districts became a tolerated, regulated, and paradoxical part of medieval life. Cities of medieval taxed and regulated prostitutes as a necessary sin. Across medieval Europe, prostitution was not only tolerated but also regulated, sometimes even by the church itself. In cities like Avignon, Paris and London, brothels were licensed, taxed, and monitored. Authorities enforced strict clothing rules so sex workers could be easily recognized. In Nuremberg, for example, they were required to wear striped veils or hoods, marking them as both visible and marginalized. By 1400, Avignon recorded roughly one prostitute for every 20 residents, a striking figure, especially in papal territory. How did society justify this? The answer lay in a peculiar logic. Influential voices like St. Augustine argued that prostitution acted as a safeguard, better to contain desire within brothel than risk disruption of respectable households. Canon law even classified it as a lesser sin, compared to solitary indulgence, since it still served procreation. Public sermons condemned it, but records quietly show clerics among its frequent patrons. Brothel often operated under official sanction. In 15th century London, the famous stews of Zurich paid fees directly to the crown, turning vice into revenue. In Zurich, sex workers had to register with city officials and undergo regular inspections.